Blackwater. The first time I met Desmond, the entire city of New Orleans was about to get swallowed by a hurricane, and he was underwater 70 feet below the surface of the Mississippi River, trying to recover 18th century artifacts from a colonial shipwreck, while I was sitting in the Emergency Operations Center, calculating flood projection models and trying to convince my team that the storm surge would exceed every prediction we'd made in the last decade. My name is Thanh. I'm 26 years old, Vietnamese American, and I work as a hurricane storm surge engineer for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, stationed in New Orleans. I was born in Ho Chi Minh City, moved to Louisiana when I was 4, and spent my entire career learning to read water the way other people read books, understanding how pressure moves through systems, how barriers redirect force, how a single miscalculation in flood projection can turn a manageable disaster into a catastrophe that kills thousands. But on September 14th, the hurricane stopped being a theoretical modeling problem and became a collision between two kinds of urgency, the urgency of protecting the future and the urgency of preserving the past. The hurricane was massive, Category 4 tracking directly toward New Orleans, with storm surge predictions that were climbing every 6 hours. By the morning of September 14th, the National Hurricane Center was predicting a storm surge of 15 to 18 feet. My models were suggesting it could be higher, potentially 20 feet or more, if the atmospheric conditions aligned in the worst possible way. The evacuation order went out at 6 a.m. The city was told to leave by noon. The levees were reinforced. The pump stations were being prepared for maximum capacity operation. Everything was in motion to protect the city from the water, except Desmond wasn't leaving. I found out about him from a frantic call that came through the Emergency Operations Center around 7:30 a.m. One of the state archaeologists was requesting emergency access to the warehouse district to retrieve artifacts from an active underwater excavation site in the Mississippi River. She was claiming that the artifacts were 18th century colonial trade goods that were irreplaceable, that they represented the only existing evidence of Franco-Spanish commercial networks in colonial Louisiana. Negative, my supervisor said immediately. All personnel must evacuate. There are no exceptions. But then I heard a different voice on the line, young, determined, and absolutely certain. With respect, sir, those artifacts are going to be submerged under 20 feet of hurricane water. The current excavation site has active wooden structures that will decompose within weeks of exposure to saltwater intrusion. We need 3 hours. Give us 3 hours and we can preserve materials that are 400 years old. 3 hours, my supervisor said, and the hurricane makes landfall. You will evacuate immediately. I should have stayed out of it. I should have focused on my storm surge calculations. But something made me open my own channel to the archaeology team, and I said, "This is Thanh, storm surge engineering. The current model suggests landfall at 4 p.m. If your team can complete operations by 11 a.m., you have a window for safe evacuation. It's tight, but it's viable." There was a pause. Then copy that. Thanh, is it? We're mobilizing now. 3 hours later, the person on the other end of that radio call was standing in my office at the Emergency Operations Center, and I understood immediately why the state archaeologist had been willing to fight so hard to keep him in the field. Desmond was impressive. Tall, probably 6'1", with deep brown Haitian features, intelligent dark eyes that held the specific light of someone who'd spent a life studying history, and he moved with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from knowing your expertise completely. He was dripping wet from the evacuation vehicle, his diving equipment still partially strapped to his body, and he was carrying a sealed container of artifacts that looked like it weighed nothing despite probably containing hundreds of thousands of dollars of historical material. "You're the engineer who gave us the window," he said. Not a question, a statement. That's me, I replied. The window is closing. You're cutting it extremely close. We got everything, Desmond said. He set the artifact container down carefully, moving with the precision of someone trained in preservation. The 1756 trade ledgers, the pottery fragments, the copper trading tokens, the leather samples, all of it. 4 hours of work compressed into 3 because you calculated the exact margin we needed. I calculated the exact margin because my models are accurate, I said. It sounded arrogant, but it was also true. Those calculations are also suggesting that the storm surge is going to exceed initial projections. The water is going to rise faster than the levee system can pump it out. The flooding is going to be severe. Desmond looked at me with an intensity that had nothing to do with the emergency and everything to do with recognition. You're scared, he said. I'm not scared, I replied. I'm accurate. I understand water systems. I understand pressure dynamics. And I understand that this hurricane is going to be worse than anyone is predicting. Then we need to make sure we protect what matters, Desmond said, both the future and the past. The hurricane made landfall at 2:47 p.m. The storm surge started climbing at 3:15 p.m. By 4 p.m. it had reached 14 feet. By 5 p.m. it was at 17 feet. By 6 p.m. it was still rising, and my calculations, which had been screaming at me that the water would exceed 20 feet, were looking prophetic in the worst possible way. The pumps were running at maximum capacity. The levee system was holding, but barely. Neighborhoods were flooding. The lower Ninth Ward was taking on water. The warehouse district where Desmond had been working just hours before was submerged under 12 feet of water and rising. I was in the Emergency Operations Center, monitoring real-time water levels, flood projections, and pump capacity data, when Desmond came and stood next to me. He'd changed out of his diving equipment into a dry shirt and pants, but his hair was still wet, and his eyes held the kind of focused intensity that suggested he understood we were in the middle of something serious. How bad, he asked, looking at my displays. 18.6 feet, I said, and still rising. The surge hasn't peaked yet. How long until it peaks? 45 minutes to an hour, based on current atmospheric conditions and tide cycles. What's the levee system rated for? 18.5 feet, I said. The number hung in the air between us. We were already past the maximum, so we're flooding, Desmond said. It wasn't a question. Strategically, I replied. I pulled up the real-time maps showing the city's flood control strategy. The levees are designed to fail in specific locations, areas we've identified as having lower property density and lower population. The water will flow through those breaches and distribute across the city instead of concentrating in any single location. It's not ideal, but it's the strategy that keeps loss of life to a minimum. What about the historical district? Desmond asked. His voice had changed, tighter. I pulled up the specific map showing the Vieux Carré, the French Quarter, the oldest part of New Orleans, the historic heart of the city. The Vieux Carré is on a natural rise. It should stay above the waterline, but it's going to be very close. Maybe 12-13 feet of water in the adjacent areas. The quarter itself might see 4 to 6 feet depending on how the surge distributes. 4 to 6 feet of water in buildings that are 300 years old, Desmond said. His hands had balled into fists. Do you understand what 4 to 6 feet of salt water does to structural integrity? The wood will absorb the water, the plaster will deteriorate, the foundations will be compromised. Buildings that have survived 3 centuries will be destabilized in hours. I understood his fear, but I also understood the math. There's nothing we can do, I said. The water is coming. The city's evacuation is complete. We're in the survival phase now. We protect what we can protect, and we accept what we can't. No, Desmond said. His voice was suddenly calm, focused. There's something we can do. We can create a localized barrier, a temporary flood wall in the Vieux Carré, something designed to keep water below 3 feet in the historic district. That's impossible, I said immediately. We don't have materials. We don't have time. The surge is still rising. Then we work with what we have, Desmond said. He was already moving toward the maps, already studying the street layout. Look, the Vieux Carré is bounded by Rampart Street on the west, the river on the east. We focus the barrier here, here, and here. He pointed to 3 specific locations, Rampart and Saint Anne.
Rampart and Canal, Rampart and Esplanade. Those are the vulnerable access points. If we block those with temporary barriers, the water can't penetrate the interior. We don't have 48 hours to construct barriers, I said. What if we don't construct them? Desmond said. He looked at me directly. What if we redirect what's already there? The water's going to accumulate debris as it moves. Logs, lumber, building materials from areas that have already flooded. What if we position crews to direct that debris into natural choke points, create barriers using the water itself? It was insane. It was also probably the only viable option for preserving any of the historical district. The calculations would be impossible, I said. Predicting debris movement in flood conditions, accounting for current variation considering pressure differentials. But you can do it, Desmond said. You understand water systems. You can calculate what the surge is going to do, and I understand the geography, the street layouts, the structural integrity of the buildings. Together, we could figure out how to protect at least some of the historic district. I looked at the maps. I looked at the real-time water level data. I looked at Desmond's face, and I saw the specific desperation of someone who was willing to die to protect something they believed in. I'm going to need your help, I said, and I'm going to need you to trust my calculations exactly. When I tell you the water is going to move in a specific direction, you position your crew accordingly. When I tell you to move, you move immediately. This isn't going to work if there's any hesitation. I trust you, Desmond said simply. I trusted you enough to stay in this city during a hurricane, because you calculated I had 3 hours. I trust your calculations more than I trust my own instincts right now. The next 4 hours were the most intense operational coordination of my life. Desmond and I worked together using the Emergency Operations Center's resources and a small team of volunteers, city workers who refused to evacuate, people who understood they were trying to prevent catastrophic historical loss. I would monitor the real-time water surge data, predict where the debris would accumulate based on current patterns and pressure differentials, and relay specific positioning instructions to Desmond. Desmond would relay those instructions to his crew, positioning them to direct debris, large pieces of lumber, shipping containers, metal construction materials that had broken free from damaged areas into the predetermined choke points. He understood terrain the way I understood water, and he could visualize spatial relationships in 3 dimensions with a precision that was remarkable. The surge is peaking at 19.2 feet, I called out at 6:47 p.m. Current is moving northeast along the Rampart corridor. I'm predicting debris concentration at the intersection of Rampart and St. Anne in approximately 8 minutes. Position your crews there with ropes and anchoring equipment. Copy, Desmond's voice came back. Crews are moving to position. Wind is shifting, I said. Southwest component is increasing. Water pressure is building from the west. The surge is starting to redirect northward. You need to reinforce the Rampart and Canal position, or the water will breach through there instead of the St. Anne intersection. Already moving crews, Desmond replied. His voice was steady, operational, completely focused. Ropes are positioned. We're ready for the surge. The water moved exactly the way my calculations predicted. The debris accumulated in the choke points exactly where Desmond's crews were positioned to intercept it. The temporary barriers formed from what should have been destructive debris, and the water began to redirect around the Vieux Carré instead of flowing through it. By 7:30 p.m., the storm surge had peaked and begun to recede. The water was still rising in other parts of the city, but in the historic district, we'd managed to keep the flooding to approximately 3 feet, well below the 6-foot threshold that would have caused structural damage. When the emergency response shifted from crisis management to assessment, Desmond and I found ourselves standing on the roof of the Emergency Operations Center, looking out over a devastated city. Water covered most of the neighborhoods. Buildings were damaged. The devastation was real and severe, but the Vieux Carré, the 300-year-old heart of New Orleans, was still standing. Damaged, yes. Flooded, yes. But structurally intact. We did that, Desmond said quietly. You did that, I replied. I just calculated the water. No, Desmond said. He looked at me directly. You did more than calculate. You adapted your calculations in real time. You understood that my mission was as important as the city's survival. You trusted me completely when I asked you to believe in something that sounded impossible. Are you seeing anyone? I asked. It was the wrong time. It was the wrong place. The city was flooded. People were suffering, and we were standing on a roof in the middle of a hurricane's aftermath. But it was also the only question that mattered. Desmond looked at me like he was seeing me completely for the first time, like he understood that in the last 4 hours, we'd built a trust that usually takes months. Like he realized that the connection was as real as the water that had just tried to destroy everything we both cared about. "No," he said, "I'm not." "Good," I said, "because what just happened, the way we worked together, the way you trusted my water calculations, and I trusted your geographical understanding, the way we saved something neither of us could have saved alone, that's not a professional collaboration. That's something else." Desmond reached over and pulled me toward him, and we were kissing on the roof of the Emergency Operations Center while the hurricane continued to rage, while the city was flooding around us, while people were fighting for survival in the water below. It tasted like salt water and exhaustion, and the specific electricity of two people who just realized they were better together than apart. A few moments later, someone coughed meaningfully below us, and we realized we'd been visible from inside. We didn't care. Let the Emergency Operations Center see. Let the city see. Sometimes love doesn't wait for perfect conditions. Sometimes it announces itself in the middle of a crisis because that's when it becomes most obvious that you need each other. The recovery took months. The city began the long process of rebuilding. Neighborhoods that had been flooded would take years to fully recover. But the Vieux Carré, thanks to our emergency barrier strategy, had survived with minimal structural damage. Desmond's team was able to begin restoration work almost immediately. Historic buildings were stabilized. The colonial artifacts he'd recovered before the hurricane were preserved safely and eventually cataloged and displayed. Desmond moved into my apartment in the warehouse district, one of the neighborhoods that had taken the most damage but was also beginning the most active reconstruction. My work with the Corps of Engineers shifted toward post-hurricane assessment and improved flood barrier design, incorporating lessons learned from the emergency response. But more than the professional work, we built a life together. We would work during the day, him on restoration and archaeology, me on flood system improvements, and then we'd meet for dinner in whatever restaurants were open, talking about our work, our passion for preserving the city, our vision for what New Orleans could become if we combine historical preservation with modern engineering. Desmond taught me to see the city the way a historian sees it, not just as a system of infrastructure that needs protecting, but as a living repository of cultural memory. I taught him to understand water systems in all their complexity, to appreciate how engineering could protect history, not just erase it. 3 months after the hurricane, we were sitting in the courtyard of a restored building in the Vieux Carré, one of the buildings that Desmond's team had stabilized during the post-hurricane recovery. The sun was setting, painting the old brick in shades of orange and gold, and the city felt like it was beginning to heal. "I have something to ask you," Desmond said. "Are you seeing anyone?" I asked before he could finish. Desmond laughed, that specific laugh that still made my chest tighten with recognition. "That's not the question, but I'll answer it. I'm only seeing you, only thinking about you, only want to build my future with you." He produced a ring, handmade from salvaged brick recovered from a colonial-era building that had been damaged in the hurricane and was being restored. Mixed with the brick was a band of refined steel from the emergency barriers we'd constructed. It was a combination of preservation and protection. It was perfect. "Will you marry me?" Desmond asked. "Will you spend your life with someone who understands that love isn't about choosing between protecting the future and preserving the past? It's about understanding that both matter and that together we can do both." "Yes," I said, because I already knew the answer. I'd known at the moment Desmond trusted my water calculations enough to position his crews exactly where I predicted the debris would accumulate. I'd known it when I trusted him to understand terrain the way I understood pressure and current. I'd known it every moment since. 6 months later, the city was continuing its recovery. New flood barrier systems were being designed with input from both my engineering team and Desmond's historical preservation colleagues. The Vieux Carré had become a model for how modern engineering could support historical preservation instead of replacing it. Desmond and I were now working on the same major project, a comprehensive flood management system for New Orleans that incorporated both cutting-edge engineering and historical preservation principles. We would spend our days in meetings and in the field, and our nights planning our future in the city that had brought us together. We were planning a small wedding in the Vieux Carré, in the courtyard of one of the buildings we'd helped save during the hurricane. The restoration was nearly complete. The old brick was being rebuilt carefully, preserving as much original material as possible while incorporating new reinforced structures that would protect it from future hurricanes. The security camera footage shows us from above, two people standing in a restored courtyard in the Vieux Carré, kissing at sunset. The timestamp reads 6:15 p.m. on December 14th. Behind us, New Orleans stretches across the landscape, still recovering, still rebuilding, but alive and vital and beautiful. But we're not looking at the city or the restored buildings or the recovery. We're looking at each other. Two people who met during a hurricane and discovered that the most powerful force wasn't water pressure or storm surge or wind velocity. It was the specific gravity of two people who'd learned that they could trust each other completely, that they could work together to protect both the future and the past, that love wasn't about choosing between different kinds of urgency. It was about integrating them. The city will face more hurricanes. Water will continue to present challenges. Systems will require constant maintenance and improvement. But we'll be there together, one person calculating the mathematics of safety and flood management, the other person understanding the historical and cultural significance of what we're protecting. That's the real preservation. That's the real resilience. That's Thanh and Desmond,